Well, thanks, Mike, for sitting down today and doing the first ever Prairie Fire podcast with me. It's an honor to be able to do that with you and to talk about your story today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, man. It's my pleasure, and it's my honor, especially with all. It's my strength and honor in this series to be the first guy in the chute, man. I appreciate it.
Yeah, no, I mean, this is a project that's really kicked off this whole series like you just talked about, and it's fitting that it's your story that I painted first and that we get to talk about first and really bring to people with detail around the specifics of what it was like for you at that time in Iraq. Because you and I have been friends for a little while now, and you've been a huge inspiration to me, and you're a big part of what's kind of brought me as an artist to really telling these stories now. And so thank you for that. I'd like to give everybody listening and watching a chance to kind of understand the background of how we came to do this project, and then we can talk about the story itself, right? Mm-hmm. So we talked a little bit before on your podcast about how we first had a phone call, a couple of years ago, maybe like one year and a half, maybe, right? Mm-hmm. It hasn't been 2 years, but we talked about some different stuff from your career, from your experiences, and this moment really jumped out at me. And I know it was something you expressed was very personal to you when you worked with the ICTF in Baghdad, in Iraq, around 2006, 2007, 2008, this time frame when it was really heavy fighting in that city. And Special Forces, American Green Berets, were working with our partner force, ISOF, and many different units to find, fix, and finish the enemy. Super dangerous, super high op tempo, right? This was a unique moment in American military history, American special ops history. A lot changed. So as we were talking about that, I was like, okay, I gotta tell the story, 100%. The first thing we did, right, we talked about like a sketch, and I showed that to you. What was it like for you when we first started to like work through the details? Like, did you mine through this stuff and start to bring up old memories? What was it like for you to start thinking about how this might be captured in art?
So I wanted to focus it on the partnership of the ICTF and Americans, because the commanders in extremist force which managed the ICTF started that unit. And when I got out of the military, years after I got out of the military, ICTF were still fighting ISIS and sacrificing their lives. Before we even knew each other, I was doing my first ever GoFundMe was for one of my snipers in ICTF mm-hmm. that I was doing stay behind missions with in 2008 that was killed in the fight against ISIS in Mosul, and I raised money for his family. So it was personal to me, and I wanted to make sure that we captured the moment that had to deal with partnership, which I think is some of the verbiage that I told you is like, these guys are brothers. They weren't just an indigenous element that we were disjointed from. We slept in the same vicinity, on the same base. We ate and broke bread together. Yeah. We operated, we drank tea. We did all of the things that you would do if these guys were Americans doing the same joint operations. And they deserved to not only have certain mediums done about them, including us talking about in a documentary, but especially in the imagery, doing it right, which I think after looking at the painting in person, you obviously did. Yeah.
I appreciate that. I mean, that was our mission. We talked about that. I remember talking about that. We gotta get this right or not do it at all.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's great. I mean, it's interesting because as you talk about the dynamics with the partner force there, it reminds me, and it did at the time, of talking to people like John Stryker-Meyer, who was MACV-SOG, right? And the relationship they had with their partner force, right? Their indigenous element that they worked with so closely. It was that same like true brotherhood, where you are fighting and potentially dying for one another, right? And that's just a level of connection that's very hard to find outside of family or a tribe, right? In fact, that's like where the name comes from. Prairie Fire, which is a honoring of MACV-SOG, and I see that same legacy in the history pulled through of what you guys did with ICTF in Iraq. So I just think it's like great as our first painting in this Strength and Honor series. I'd like to get into like the actual background because I don't know that everybody knows about some of the detail of the story itself, right? So just kind of backing up to set the stage, where were you on 9/11? And how did you, of course, come to find out that our world had changed forever?
Yeah, so I was in Fayetteville Technical Community College, which is a horrible school. I'll never go there. In a horrible town. Fayetteville is not. I'm not a big fan of Fayetteville. Stationed there most of my career, but I was actually on terminal leave because I had just gotten out of the military and transitioned from active duty with 4 years in the infantry to the National Guard, and was going to go to school. There wasn't a fight going on, and it bummed me out. It kind of bummed me out. It bummed me out. And when that all changed, I immediately knew that there was going to be a fight. It was only a matter of time, and the clock was ticking, and I needed to get back in. So I went straight back in and went straight to Special Forces selection, and spent the rest of my career in the GWOT.
Now, as we kind of move into OIF, right, and Operation Iraqi Freedom, and the beginning and genesis of that fight, when did you serve in Iraq? What years did you do tours there?
Yeah, I did. So I was in the Q course during the invasion of Iraq, and then I did Afghanistan before I did OIF. But I did 2006, 2007, 2008, 2009, 2013. Or maybe it had been 14, all in Iraq. So I got 5 rotations to Iraq, and working with the ICTF, I knew they were a thing because I heard about them in the Q course. You know, we pulled those guys into Jordan and isolated them and trained them up. But yeah, my OIF rotations are many, and half of those rotations were with the ICTF operating.
What was it like to be in the Q course? Like you said before, when you got out, no war, and then you're in the Special Forces qualification course, and you know what's coming. Like, what was that like, and what were the interactions with your cadre like? Like, what were you guys talking about as you were like looking forward to graduation?
Yeah, it's funny because I went to selection during the invasion of Afghanistan, and I went to the Q course during the invasion of Iraq, and it scared the crap out of me because I was like, it's going to be over, right? That's everybody's mindset.
By Christmas, right?
Yeah, it's like I missed both invasions because I was training, and it's going to be over. And we all know now, looking back, it wasn't even close to being over. But it was very relevant in everything we were doing. Every day we took seriously because we knew that the information we were being taught at that specific time could potentially save us. And my instructors, like one of my 18 Bravo instructors, which is the Special Forces Weapons course, had just been shot with a PKM and had no use of one of his arms. So they moved him to Special Warfare Center, to SWIC, and he was one of my instructors. And he taught us the PKM. So he's teaching us a foreign weapon on a machine gun that he, within the year, had just been shot with. And I'm like, holy crap, man. This is as real as it gets. And they always told us, hey, in the Q course, you never know, you might go straight to war. And I deployed to Afghanistan 2 weeks after I reported to group.
Wow.
So it was relevant. It was an amazing experience training-wise, and I took it very seriously.
Now, where were you in Special Forces when you started those Iraq rotations, and where were you in Special Forces as far as like what were you a part of when you first had contact with ICTF or ISOF?
So, ISOF, the Iraqi Special Operations Forces, is a very substantial units. I mean, it's a large unit. It includes the 36 Commandos, which has since been changed. It includes the Iraqi Counter Terrorism Force. Neighboring that in the Ministry of Interior, which is basically the police forces of Iraq, is the ERU or ERB, Emergency Response Unit, when we stood them up, and then Emergency Response Battalion. So I was an assaulter and breacher assigned to the Commanders and Extremists Force, which is a crisis contingency unit that's capable of doing direct action, special reconnaissance, hostage rescue, all the mission sets, in collaboration with a joint task force, JTF, with JSOC. So we're a little higher trained, higher selected, and our mission set required us to do specific actions in war. I mean, if you're a Green Beret and you go to Iraq, you potentially could be in a fire base or a base of operations doing Green Beret stuff.
Sure.
I mean, you can hit up with a 6-month rotation where you're just training indigenous forces where you don't even go into combat.
Sure.
For the CIF, the Commanders and Extremist Force, not the Central Issuing Facility, which a lot of people are like, Mike was in the CIF? He issued out equipment?
Yeah.
No. When I was in the CIF, the hottest thing going was doing counterterrorism, foreign internal defense with ICTF and smacking targets.
Yep.
Because you wanted, this early on in this phase of operations, we hadn't handed things over. We were still doing stuff by, with, and through. So we were partnered doing joint operations, and I kind of got to see every phase of that throughout my career. But I was assigned as an assaulter who was working directly with the operators of the ICTF at that time period. And then throughout my different career positions, managed an entire troop of ICTF with a troop sergeant major. So we would do the ground force commanding positions. And then even with a joint task force with a special missions unit, I got to utilize ICTF to do special things in Iraq.
So you had Afghanistan under your belt before you went to Iraq. Of course, in Iraq, as many of our listeners and viewers will be familiar with, I mean, the war machine was operating on a scale that really hadn't been seen in a very long time, right? I mean, what was it like in Iraq when you first got off the plane? What was the experience like to be in that country? Was that your first time over there, in the Middle East specifically?
Yeah, 06 was the first Iraq trip. I did a 9-month fire base rotation in Afghanistan. But Iraq had a different feel and vibe about it. I mean, I was in Afghanistan during Operation Red Wings and a whole bunch of drama. But it was a different feeling. The day I arrived in Iraq, our PDSS, our pre-deployment site survey group of guys who were on ADVON, they were basically the advance, getting all the intel to be able to right seat ride us in a better position to have a shorter handover, because you got two teams that are rotating in, one's going out, one's going in, and then you got to have that continuity. They had just come off target and killed a whole bunch of bad guys. And the vehicles they were in got shot up. And they had just pulled in when we pulled into the base. And I'm like, you guys just killed a whole bunch of bad guys? You guys just got shot up? I'm like, yes. This is exactly where I need to be.
Yeah.
And during that time period of 06, we were surging American forces trying to kill and capture as many bad guys as possible, because we were technically losing the war. We didn't know kind of our position of getting between Sunnis and Shias. We didn't know who best to target. Was it the Mahdi militia or was it radical Sunnis? And when I went there, I remember at some point during that rotation, the gloves came off and we started going hard in the paint. And the advantage always with indigenous forces is the perception is the reality. If you put an Iraqi face on the front of the sit rep, the situation report, or the headline in the news report, that is going to be how it's depicted. And that's very important in war, especially a dynamic and aggressive campaign, especially in counterterrorism. So we were going out doing missions every day, and you kill a guy. He could be the leader of a terrorist cell. And within hours, his predecessor was set up for success, and now you had to target a new guy. So we had a target deck this thick with a couple task force units going out and spanking targets, and ICTF was one of them.
And it's constantly evolving. So
Constantly.
you're hitting one target, and then sometimes that very same night you have a follow-on target based on intel you got from the previous target.
Yeah, it was a very fluid war. You know, the JSOC's motto at the time was "at the speed of war." The Joint Task Force motto was that, and it was very true, because when you hit a target and you get information and tactical interrogation on that target, you have a very short window to hit follow-on targets or objectives to target these personnel. It could be affiliates, it could be facilitators, it could be HVTs, high-value targets. That was like taking down a spiderweb network that continued to evolve and grow. And how you had to get ahead of them is through aggression, through volume, through speed at war. So we were considered one of the action arms that was just going out every night, utilizing those tactics, those techniques and procedures to be able to fluidly operate. And that could be 2 to 3 targets a night. That could be no sleep, and then you go into daytime hits the following day. It was very, very much the most dynamic part of the war. And everybody I talked to who's been involved in those time periods of 06, 07, and 08, we always share the common experience, which is we were crushing bad guys. And yes, sure, they would win every once in a while. I think every rotation I did Iraq, I lost a guy either on my team or in my company. So it didn't come without sacrifice, but man, we weighed it weighed heavily in our favor.
And of course, in the training that led up to that mission, but also through all the experience, you also created a force that continued to go on and defeat the enemy even after we left Iraq, right? I mean, there's a lot of history that we'll talk about, you know, with the ICTF in Mosul fighting ISIS and beyond in the war against ISIS, that is a legacy of the investment made at that time by both entities in this constantly evolving battle space.
Yeah, and I think it's an important point because, especially with the Afghanistan stuff falling apart, many people don't have context of what it could have been. And when I talk about Iraqi history in the period of time that I operated with the ICTF, I had an understanding of where they came from, where they were isolated, they were trained, they were brought back in. I even helped run their operator training course and selection. And when you stand behind an Iraqi counterterrorism operator, you would not be able to tell the difference between an American and an ICTF guy. And in a lot of cases, these guys had more combat experience than our guys. You would get a Green Beret. Typically, a commander's inexperienced force guy is not a new guy, but sometimes there were new guys. Like first group, especially C11, Charlie Company, 1st Battalion, 1st Special Forces Group had new guys, a whole bunch of them, because I went to training with them, and then they rotated in for us for one of our rotations. They would show up and they thought they had a path or a way, not realizing that the guys they were working with was not like Afghanistan or even some parts of Iraq. They had frequent, constant combat experience, and in most cases knew better in planning and execution how to better tackle some problem sets. I mean, it was their country. I mean, some of the houses that we hit were in the neighborhoods some of these guys lived.
Yeah.
And when you look at the evolution of that, we pulled up we drew down forces and basically pulled out, only leaving contingents in 2014, 2013-14 time period. And when we did that, we opened through this gap that we left, this vacuum that we left the opportunity for ISIS to come back. ISIS was the original OGs of the Iraqi campaign, who were all the bosses from the Saddam Hussein regime. And they spawned and evolved. It's basically Al-Qaeda 2.0 because they had the marketing campaign. And it was aggressive, it scaled very rapidly. But if we didn't train those guys in 2004 and commit to that experience, we would have not had a capable fighting force to be able to do the brunt of the work that took them out of Erbil, that crushed ISIS in Mosul, that kept them out of Baghdad. I would think, based on my understanding of, for example, the Battle of Mosul, if it wasn't for that training, if it wasn't for the sacrifice of Americans and especially the ICTF, ISIS would be saturated through that region. We didn't learn that lesson in any form in Afghanistan. We withdrew forces, never kept the contingent, pulled completely out, and the Taliban were all the sons of all the mujahideen that fought for their country against the Russians in the 80s, and we completely abandoned ship and handed it over to them and created another vacuum where we didn't learn the lesson, where they could have been a capable force like the ICTF. So now you have a success where there were many failures in Iraq, and they have a complete failure for not paying attention to history in Afghanistan, which is one of the reasons we wanted to do this documentary.
Yeah, and it's a good point to just pause and talking about your story specifically, and we'll get back to that in a second, but to let everyone know who's listening and watching, what are you putting together for this documentary? It's gonna be a documentary specifically about ICTF and what we're talking about here. What is beginning to shape? I'm sure it's still, developing, it's evolving, but what are we talking about? And then we'll talk about exactly how our effort with the painting is tied to that.
Yeah, I had the idea around 2016 time period when I had one of my snipers, Issa. He was killed in the Battle of Mosul when he stepped on a pressure plate IED. I mean, I worked for the CIA at the time and was getting Facebook messages from my buddy Mohammed, who was in the Battle of Mosul, like sending me like, hey, look, Mike, I just killed all these bad guys. I'm like, don't ever send me that again over Facebook Messenger. And I was very, very involved information-wise of the campaign because I was mentoring those guys. I was very passionate about training those guys. So when Issa was killed, I raised money for his family in a GoFundMe campaign and got it to his brother, who was the sergeant major of the ICTF. And he wanted to give it to his family, and they were very thankful. And I thought always, what can I do to help these guys? Outside of being next to them in a gunfight, is there anything I could do? And I think historically, we need to be able to capture the impact and significance that they had, but also educate new generations of warfighters and American citizens on how it really works. I mean, there's a lot of guys who have created this very toxic narrative around indigenous forces. Like, why would you do anything for those booger eaters? Like, well, one, because we conduct combat operations with them. So if you want to get shot in the back of the head during an operation, then treat them like crap. Don't build rapport. But also, more significant is it's the Green Beret way of how we've conducted operations. Like you mentioned, John Stryker Meyer and the MACV-SAW guys. They're Montagnards and they're indigenous forces where the glue that allowed them to operate so well in those environments. They knew the language, they knew the culture, they knew the terrain. And that's, from my experience, it was almost like a replication of the MACV-SAW experience with the ICTF. And this documentary got put on hold year after year. I mean, 17, 18 were dangerous years. Then all the stuff, I was gonna do it last year where I was gonna fly. And we were gonna film a a segment of it, and there was debate. Do we do it big? Do it small? My incentive is I want people to understand the sacrifice, but I want to do it right. So we're going to have interviews by special operations guys from the origin story of ICTF. We're going to go to Iraq and film on the ground. Last year was a little hot with ISIS. This year's a little bit better. The debacle in Afghanistan didn't help because that was one of our windows.
Sure.
But I think this winter will be the effort. And, you know, we haven't talked about the proceeds, but, you know, any financial support of something this big. I want it to be on Netflix.
Sure.
I want it to be on a big platform. I don't want it to live on my cell phone. I want it to live on something so people could see it. So I'm excited about it. It will go. It will happen likely this summer or this summer for Baghdad, but this winter for us.
Yeah, it's been super exciting and inspiring to hear about it because it's a part of the genesis of this painting project that we've worked on together. And like you just said, I mean, there is a lesson in humility for American warfighters in the future and Americans in general with this story, to see the brotherhood and then the effectiveness of the partner after even our direct interaction, you know, what they did in Iraq fighting ISIS. It's incredible. You know, I think a lot of Americans forget the sacrifices that Arab Muslims made for this country to be safe.
I know, it's crazy. I've been in gunfights with these guys, and they saved our lives.
It's incredible. And I think it ties back to some of the history and legacy of American Special Operations and some of the lessons we can see. Like, we go back to World War II, right? I mean, we're talking about a tremendous fight against an existential threat that determined the future of the whole world, right? And yet at the same time, the United States government was putting Japanese Americans, citizens, people, citizens of generations in essentially concentration camps.
Yeah.
And it was in that context, and you know, a generation earlier, German Americans came under tremendous abuse from their neighbors because of what was going on in World War I in Europe. And yet, at so many different times in the history of American Special Operations, key innovators have recognized that the strength in America is in its diversity. So I think back to like Donovan and the OSS. You know, who is he recruiting to go do some of the most dangerous missions in China, or even as they start to work around Japan? He's going into those camps and he's recruiting Japanese Americans, citizens who are like, yeah, even though I'm being treated this way, I'm gonna volunteer to go do an incredibly dangerous mission, right? He's recruiting Chinese Americans to go into China, right? Like you said, McAfee-Sauk, you know, some of the most valuable players you even hear about in the invasion of Afghanistan are Afghan Americans who happen to be at the right place at the right time to bridge the gap, make things happen that, you know, somebody who was some blonde-haired, blue-eyed guy from the Midwest like wouldn't have been able to do. You know what I mean? So it really is cool, and it's one of the things why I've been so excited and passionate about telling the story as a painting, and how we're so excited that with the print release from this painting, that we're going to be able to contribute to this documentary and help, you know, contribute in a small way to seeing it come to fruition. I'm just like super pumped to be a part of it.
Yeah, I appreciate that. That's a big thing for us, and very personal for me. And I selfishly want to promote I want every American to have this hanging on their wall, because I want people to be able to share that story and understanding of how significant it is. You know, I think about the indigenous elements that I've worked with throughout my military special forces career. I mean, the guys that I trained in Afghanistan were with Robert Miller, the first 3rd Special Forces Group Medal of Honor, Green Beret GWAT recipient of the Medal of Honor, who was tragically killed in the incident, posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. But he was side by side with the indigenous forces that he was with that sacrificed themselves as well. And so in all of these stories, working by, with, and through these partner forces, there are significant acts of heroism and bravery that are never told, never captured, and lost forever. I mean, John Stryker Meyer is a prime example, like how he tells those stories about his guys. I have the same exact stories, and I think every member of the Commanders in Extremist Force that has worked with the ICTF has those stories, and it's cool kind of pulling it together.
Yeah, it's awesome. So, shifting back to your experience in the campaign itself, I kind of just want to talk a little bit about what the experience was like. We talked about a lot of it at night. Night after night, you give us sort of some broad brushstrokes on what was the experience like. What was it like to be with your guys? What were you doing? What was maybe a day in the life of Mike Glover at that time like?
Yeah, the rotations varied on the specifics of the mission set, but as depicted, direct action operations where we would receive the intel and brief the host nation, the ICTF, and then go out and hit the targets were pretty routine in that time period because there were so many targets to hit. We had a good battle rhythm, and we had what's called the playbook, which is this cycle of operations on how we conducted these mission sets. So for us, it was a rotation of training, and then also conducting the operations. One of my most memorable rotations was working with the ICTF and mentoring the troop sergeant major and conducting operations from a ground force commander's perspective and managing the whole thing. Because, you have fewer Green Berets as the war progressed on the objective. I mean, as demonstrated in this and displayed in this picture, there's a ratio where you have Green Berets with ICTF. At the tail end of my rotations with ICTF, we were restricted to a couple of Americans operating with the indigenous guys, including ICTF. And that was a level of trust that we progressed and worked up to. I did sniper stay-behind missions for a couple months in Iraq where we were infiltrating into dangerous areas, sometimes using cover, using presence patrol, and it was just a couple snipers, me included. I was a sniper in the SF at the time, and I'd have 5 Iraqis and me and a commo guy, and we'd stay 72 hours, sometimes longer, in an urban hide, trying to kill or capture a bad guy across the street. Those moments made you appreciate the lead up. Because, one, we use senior guys to do those kind of operations who understand the ICTF, but it was like reuniting with family.
Sure.
I would come into the rotation, they'd be like, Mike, and then I'd go out and hey, we're doing sniper stay-behinds. It was just an amazing overall experience, especially knowing the OGs in my company had started ICTF in Jordan, and here we are years later, and getting to a point where we're going to allow them to unilaterally operate, which we eventually did.
Yeah, that's incredible. It's like you said, it's an amazing moment in American military history, in the history of the GWAT, what was happening at that time. One of the things I know is true is that there's just books and books written about the innovation in gear, tactics, stuff on the ground, right? And a lot changed, right, during that time. You guys figured out a lot of stuff that then has been carried forward as teaching points, has changed the way these types of operations are conducted, right? Without getting into, obviously, the details that, we don't want to talk about, right? Just, can you give us a sense of what it was like to be innovating at that time, to be a part of that evolution of both gear and also tactics and just how you approach problems?
Yeah, it's interesting because, how you learn those lessons is with the frequency and volume of war. And I always use a law enforcement example. If a department doesn't want to hear, let's say I go into a department, which has happened to me before, and I'm like, hey guys, this way isn't the best way, and here's why. Now, they go, well, Mike, that's never happened before. And I go, well, I've seen it happen before, or I've experienced it happening before. And if the subtlety and tactic is you do, instead of X, you do Y, but both X and Y would work, except for X, could lead to bad outcomes and Y could lead to better outcomes, then why would you debate it? Well, a department could have a bad shoot, a bad experience in the house, and it changes the protocol of that department forever. But most departments won't evolve or adapt unless that bad has happened, right? They're waiting for the catastrophe. Everybody knows it's wrong, but nobody does anything. In war, you don't have that luxury, because tonight's op, if you don't change for tomorrow's op, could lead to somebody paying with their life. Let me give you an example, because it's pretty known, because I've talked about it as an experience. The call out. Al Qaeda's tactics originally, before they got smarter, they didn't have barricaded PKM machine guns pointing at the threshold. They didn't have pressure plate IEDs in the thresholds of doors. And then when they started doing that, we started dying. I have many rotations with different task force where we're losing a lot of guys, dozens of guys in special operations, where a tough decision was going to have to be made. How do you tell the most aggressive operators in the world that surprise, violence, and speed of action is not always the best way? Mm-hmm. It's tough. But when they evolved into, hey, now we're going to call out, like, why would we do that? Well, after you do SSC and you discover the barricaded machine gun, or you go to call them out and everybody comes out and starts clacking themselves off, and you go, wow, if we would have hit the front door like we normally do, we would have been killed. That evolution was coming from mistakes being made in real time. And the ICTF was a war machine churning out missions every single night, sometimes 3, sometimes 5 times a night. I mean, there were many companies, many troops where we were going in 5 different directions, going after the worst terrorist in the country. And at a transitional period, unilateral ops was not the way. Mm-hmm. Everybody wanted to kick doors in and shoot people in the face as a commando, but now we had to get to a point where it was just about the bilat option, doing joint operations, and we got to a point where it was this, and then we got to a point where we were on containment in the ORP, the objective rally point, maybe at a staging position, mm-hmm. and launching a unilateral Iraqi mission into the op. Those are the phases and progression you want to see, and that happened so violently, so courageously. It was an epic part of my war experience.
And it's important for us to mention as well that at this time, ICTF is operating in and around Baghdad a lot, right? You know, on some of those very important missions. At the same time, there's other ISOF elements like you described around the country in places like Basra and others that are working with other special forces units and other SOF partners doing the same kind of thing. I mean, it's a large struggle, and there's so many stories that can come out of these relationships, and that's one of the cool things about the Special Forces mission there is that, you know, many of these stories can be shared as guys moved around and did different things with different partners.
Yeah, all these stories are so lost, man. I mean, the ICTF was the surgical element in the Special Operations of Iraq, and then there was like Ranger Battalion elements that were going out doing large, movement to contact operations, flushing out entire villages or entire towns, and they all had a part. My part, which was with ICTF, was profound in my own experience, but there's so many other ones. Like my training director, Sean Kirkwood, who's a Silver Star recipient, was with ICTF in an epic mission in Najaf where they were doing a quick reaction to a bigger army element. And, you know, Sean gets out of the truck and gets shot point blank range right out of the truck and has to fight for days or 18 hours into it, an 18-hour gunfight. They lose an Apache, ICTF guys are killed. And that story is only being told in our documentary, Stories of Survival, with Black Rifle Coffee. And it's like, man, why don't you hear more of this? Yeah. I want people profoundly to see the interest in this. I will write a book on the ICTF in the next 3 years, likely. The documentary and everything else is tied to that. It's about making people understand that Iraq, where Sunnis and Shias and Kurds came together, because we had all of them in our partner force, we're going out every single night, taking it to the enemy with Americans side by side. And that needs to be told. And it's very well illustrated here.
So as we have prints, roll out from the painting, as we work forward on the documentary, as the story is beginning to be told, like you mentioned, a book in the future, what are some really important messages today that you want the listeners and viewers to step away from, both Americans in general, people who are following Prairie Fire, Fieldcraft Survival, and also specifically too, how about even like future special operators, right? Like people who are listening and watching right now who aspire to follow in your footsteps and the footsteps of others, right? What are a couple of takeaways for those different groups that you really want to drive home?
Yeah, when I joined the Army and in my special operations path, I thought unilateral American operations, doing that, kicking in doors was the only way, the only path. As I became more of a strategic planner as a senior member of special operations, I started to discover to stay in the fight, you needed to become very good at building partner relationships and doing bilateral operations. And I took that experience and brought it into Yemen, Pakistan, Libya, where, I stood up the first counterterrorism Libyan force, me personally, with a couple of my guys, ever in Libya. And if it wasn't for those lessons that were fought in sacrifice and blood in Iraq, I wouldn't have had that understanding. If you're a young member of special operations, if you're a young man or woman who want to serve in some capacity, the best mission set I've ever seen is doing collaborative joint efforts with host nations. And that's how wars are won. They're not won, there's a very specific requirement for war through attrition, through action arms that kill bad guys. And that's a thing. But doing the breaking bread and joint everything is how strategies are won. And a lot of guys don't get that. And they're just, there's a stigma tied to it. But having done it my entire career, it is the way to stay in the fight and to stay relevant, which is significant for the warfighter. For the Americans back home who have no understanding of what the hell I just said, I would say you should understand that we've abandoned partners throughout history, even in World War II. The OSS were training partisan and auxiliary forces going behind enemy lines. The Montagnards and indigenous elements that we worked with in Vietnam, Korean war indigenous elements that were going behind enemy lines in North Korea, specifically the Tiger units. We did that just recently in Afghanistan. We got to understand that there are allies that need our help, which is why I am a board member of Save Our Allies. And if you want to help, you go to saveourallies.org, because there's a bigger picture than what happens because it's on the media report, and then what happens when we pull out. Those people's lives are affected forever. I mean, those Iraqis who are in war the entire time, they have PTSD. They have issues. They don't have a Veterans Affairs over there. We're getting involved. We should take the long approach to taking care of those guys. They don't get the nonprofit help that we get. So yeah, I just want to tell Americans that you should pay attention to the indigenous elements that are sacrificing their lives with these Americans, because it's part of the story.
It's great. Well, this painting and the prints that we'll be releasing as part of a special collector's edition with Mike Lover, your signature, et cetera, will be something we'll have more information about after this podcast. And we'll have information about how through the purchase of the prints, folks can not only remember this story, remember the American and Iraqi guys who sacrificed, but also show them honor, and in doing so, contribute to the documentary project. We'll also post information as we have it for how people can contribute directly to the documentary in the future as it comes together. And I just, really appreciate you coming on to, Prairie Fire's first podcast and, sharing with us, the story behind the painting, Mike, your story, and some really important lessons that we can all learn from.
No, it's my pleasure and it's an honor. I mean, it's a real cool tribute. It's a way to get people involved. I love it. All those proceeds will go into the Fieldcraft Fund, which is a 501c3, and then be strategically pushed into helping build out this documentary. I just want to say I appreciate you for taking on this journey, because it's not easy to be an artist, a marketeer, an advocate, and all these things. And these are the projects that we like to get behind and helping tell these stories. But if it wasn't for you and your hard work and commitment, your passion for art and giving back, we wouldn't be able to have this conversation. So I appreciate you, and hopefully everybody here subscribes to the Fieldcraft podcast, and I'll be pushing people from Fieldcraft and Black Rifle and everybody to come pay attention more to this and this effort, because it's an important mission.
Yeah, thank you, Mike. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks, man.
Awesome.